Alright guys, today we're going to carry on with area of study 1, Australian Indigenous culture, by looking at the policies of protection and segregation. We want to really focus on how these policies suppressed Australian Indigenous culture. So hopefully you will be able to describe what protection is and what the policy's aims were. You'll be able to describe what the Aboriginal Protection Board was. You'll be able to explain the effects of protection on Aboriginal people. How did that actually play out? You'll be able to describe segregation and what its aims were. And hopefully you'll be able to link it back to that concept that we learned about last lesson of ethnocentrism. And you'll be able to answer the question, how can protection and segregation be seen as ethnocentric? Okay, let's jump in. So let's look at protection first. So protection stemmed from this idea that Aboriginal Australians were less evolved and that because of that they needed to be protected. Basically, they were thought of as inferior and that they certainly were not capable of looking after themselves and having the full rights of white Australian citizens. Now, this wasn't just a thought that people went around thinking. This was enshrined in law. So in the 1800s, most states had protection laws, and these were called the Aboriginal Protection Acts. And these laws said, as you can see in the picture, to provide for the protection and management of the Aboriginal natives of Victoria. So these acts, these laws, reduced the status of the Indigenous populations to wards of the state. Now, if you're a ward of the state, you are basically controlled by the government. You're not in charge of your own life. The government looks after and controls your life for you. And that stems to almost all aspects of your life. So we had these Aboriginal Protection Acts that were in law, and in order to kind of carry out that law, the body that was responsible for it was called the Aboriginal Protection Board. Hopefully you will have come across this when you looked at Rabbit Proof Rents in Year 10 English. Sorry to bring it back to English, but I'm an English teacher. So the Aboriginal Protection Board, basically they were responsible for enacting everything to do with the Aboriginal Protection Acts. So the board controlled where Aboriginal people could live, what work they could do, who they could associate with, and who they could marry. And as you can imagine, all of the opportunities for each of those were very limited. Aboriginal children were removed from their families and communities to be educated within a European system. And this is something that we see throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The board made sure that Aboriginal people had to seek permission to marry, they had to seek permission to work or to move. They actually kept the wages of employed Aboriginal people. So if they were able to get a job, they would keep either most or all of the money that they earned. Mixed race children were removed from their families. Again, we see this again and again. And when the board did remove people from their families, they were brought up with white families and they were forced to assimilate. We'll look at assimilation policy in more detail next lesson. The language here is obviously pretty wordy and difficult, but I do want to just draw attention to what these laws actually looked like in writing. So, this was actually in our country's law in the 1800s. So, prescribing the place where any Aboriginal or any tribe of Aborigines shall reside. Basically, we get to say where you can live. That means if we don't want you living in particular places, we will get you out of there. Remembering this is land that Aboriginal people had been on for tens of thousands of years. Just talking about money, apportioning amongst Aboriginals the earnings of Aboriginals under any contract. So that means if you've got a job and you've got a contract, we're going to control that money. Because of this idea of protection, we're protecting you, we're looking after you, we're caring for you. But actually, what that meant in practice is we are controlling you. And down the bottom for the care, custody, and education of the children of Aborigines. Um, Sometimes protection policy can sound a lot gentler than it was in practice. So on paper, it sounds like, they're looking after these people, they're responsible for their care and their custody and their education. But in practice, then that meant literally taking them from their homes and from their families and bringing them up in a culture that wasn't their own. These are kind of two of the wilder ones, I think. Even down to, if you look really deeply in this act, it says all blankets, bedding, clothing, and other articles issued or distributed to the Aboriginals by or by the direction of the board shall be considered on loan only and shall remain the property of Her Majesty. So this means that, you're not doing so well, we'll give you some blankets and some bedding and some clothing, but you can't even have them. They're just on loan. We still own them. Looking at here, number 43, shall be lawful to order any Aboriginal found loitering in any city or town of the colony, or not being decently clothed, to leave such city or town. Basically, if you're hanging around and we don't like what you're doing or what you're wearing or where you are, we can kick you out. This is all under the guise of protection. Looking at segregation, which literally means to separate and to cut off. So this is where we look at Aboriginal reserves and missions. So reserves and missions, generally reserves were run by the government and missions were run by the church, but they often operated really similarly. So imagine kind of big patches of land, big houses, farmland, that Aboriginal people were separated out to and forced to live, just in that area, in that mission or reserve. So again, the governments argued that this was done for their own protection. Another really important thought behind protection and segregation was the idea that Aboriginal people were dying out. So they said Aboriginal people were a dying race who were doomed to disappear. So again, because of that, it was this idea that the government was able to justify taking them away and supposedly looking after them. The aim of segregation, so reserves and missions were highly institutionalised. So think about it like, the most extreme, strict boarding school that you can think of, except probably with a little bit more abuse. And their aim was to civilise Aboriginal people. And again, there's that really paternalistic, patronising thought in there that, you aren't civilised, you're so inferior, you need our help to be able to speak and act and think like us, the superior white man. This is a video that we'll look at in class, but I just want to bring it back to this question, which is really what the study designer asks you, which is how did protection and segregation suppress culture? So remembering that this whole unit of sociology is about culture. Yes, it affected them in a huge number of very traumatic ways, as you can imagine, but how did it actually prevent them from practicing their culture? So the first thing we need to understand is this first point. It was the very aim of protection and segregation. Their very aim was to suppress culture. That was what they set out to do. They didn't want Aboriginal culture to exist, and they wanted the dominant white culture to be all there was. Another way is that segregation policies removed children from their families and denied them knowledge of their family heritage, ancestors, and traditions. So when we talked in the first lesson about culture is passed down and learned through socialisation and through family, because of protection and segregation, Aboriginal people didn't have access often to their families and to all of the social networks that would teach them about their culture. So these policies didn't let them learn about their culture because they cut them off from the very people who would teach them those things. The next point is about language. Language is a really important part of culture. Again, for Aboriginal people on reserves and missions, they were not allowed to use their own language, to use their Indigenous languages. Often there were really harsh punishments if they were found talking in their language. They were forced to use English and only English. So again, they suppressed culture by suppressing language. Lots of the people that grew up on these missions didn't grow up learning the languages of their people. And the last one, and of course there are plenty more ways, but I wanted to just distill it down to these three. People were denied freedom of movement and association and couldn't participate in cultural practices or traditions. And so a lot of those opportunities to participate in ceremony, in various other traditions, in cultural practices like art or music or dance or all of the other material and non-material elements of their culture was restricted, because like we saw in those laws, if they were found out, by themselves or wearing something that the white people deemed was not appropriate, or in a place that they deemed was not appropriate, it was in law that they were allowed to be punished. So because of those freedoms being restricted, they weren't able to participate in cultural practices. I really want you to take note of this slide, because it's very likely that an exam or a SAT question will be phrased like this. Something like, how did Australian policies of protection and segregation suppress Australian Indigenous culture? So if you were able to make some points like this, then that would be, you'd be well on your way to getting some points on a question like that. The last slide, I'm actually just going to leave as a question, which is a little bit sneaky, but we'll discuss this in class, and I want you to have a really good think about it so you can be able to answer this question, which is definitely another kind of exam style question. How can protection policies be considered ethnocentric? Now again, go back to that definition of ethnocentric. If you have ethnocentric thinking, you're evaluating another culture by the standards of your own. So ethnocentric thinking often treats other cultures as inferior, as less evolved, as illogical, unnatural. So how can we consider protection and segregation policies ethnocentric? Okay, I'm going to leave you with that question. Thank you very much. In the next set of slides, we'll have a look at some of the Indigenous responses to all of these policies. Okay, thank you. See you soon.